Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's panel for the NACD Veterans Cohort as we lead into Memorial Day weekend. We know how busy you are, and we really appreciate you joining us today. I want to thank our generous sponsors, Zscaler and Global Guardian, for hosting this event for us. I'm Patrick Houston. I'm an Army veteran. I am based in San Francisco, and I'm the COO and General Counsel of Ondas. We are a publicly traded defense and technology company focused on autonomous systems. Today's topic is governing risk under pressure, and it's one that I care about deeply as both a veteran and an executive. So the actual title is Leading Under Pressure, Governing Risk When It Matters Most. And I want to frame the question that we're really here to answer, which is when information is incomplete and timelines are compressed and the consequences of mistakes are severe, how should directors govern? How do you make good decisions with incomplete information when you can't afford to be wrong? And given that context, that framework, I will tell you that we could not have picked a better group to help us answer that question. All three of our panelists have absolutely lived this, not just in the boardroom, but on the battlefields, in the highest stakes environments possible, and I'm thrilled to welcome them. I'm going to ask our three panelists to each introduce themselves briefly, then I'll add a note or two. Let's start with Eric, please.
Hi, everybody. Eric Taraz, Air Force veteran, Senior VP at Global Guardian. Global Guardian is a proud member of NACD, both the California chapter as well as the national chapter. Global Guardians were based out of McLean, Virginia. They're in Tyson's Corner, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We are a global security firm. We have a footprint in over 140 countries. We are a one-button solution for everything safety, security, travel, and medical related. And our clients are split between corporate clients and family clients. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Eric. I'll just add that with your background in Air Force Special Operations, I know that we crossed paths somewhere along the way. I just don't know where, or if we figured it out, whether we'd be able to tell anyone. Nevertheless, it's great to have you here, and thank you for sponsoring this event. Over to you, Mary.
Hey, thanks, Patrick. I'm Mary O'Brien. I'm a corporate director and advisor to defense tech and AI companies. I am NACD certified. The foundation for the work that I do now is 34 years in the Air Force, retiring as a lieutenant general or a 3-star. I served as the Joint Staff CIO and director of C4 Cyber, so command control, communications, and computers. Before that, I worked in the Pentagon as the Headquarters Air Force Director of Intelligence and Cyber Effects. Really looking forward to this conversation. I would say that with 34 years of leading in what generally were the VUCA environments, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, the principles of leading in those types of environments are timeless, even when our uniforms may look a little different. So glad to be here.
Thanks, Mary. I will share for the audience that I serve on the Ondas advisory board with you, and it's fantastic to have you as a battle buddy. So thanks for being here today. Bob, over to you, please.
Thanks, Patrick, and hello, everyone. And it's an honor to be part of this esteemed panel today, talking about risk. I'm going on about 18 months since I retired after 40 years in the military, both Navy and the Air Force. I have my own LLC, Skinner Strategic Solutions, and I'm doing corporate boards and working with advisories for consulting companies in information technology, cyber, leadership, organizational design, you name it. We're supporting a lot of different companies in that regard, and I look forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, Bob. And since you served in both the Air Force and the Navy, I'll say that both of those are excellent services in the top 5 of all the military services, somewhere right behind the Army out there. So great to have you here. I'll say for the audience, that Bob was in charge of DISA. So he basically ran the entire IT backbone for the entire Pentagon, both classified and unclassified. And I'm sure he has some stories and some thoughts on cybersecurity for large organizations. It's great to be here with all of you. I want to start with a quick round of questions, just maybe a sentence or two from each of you. If you think back on your career, your time in the military, what is a word or a phrase that kind of describes the leadership environment you operated in, or perhaps something the military taught you about risk that you think a corporate board would benefit from? Let's kind of reverse the order here and start with Bob and then Mary and then back to you, Eric.
Thanks, Patrick. And yes, I did forget to mention that I was Defense Information Systems Agency, as well as this organization called the Joint Force Headquarters Department of Defense Information Networks. Big, long title, but really we focused on operating, securing, and defending the entire Department of Defense, Department of War networks, about 15,000 overall. So a lot of scope and scale, and had a great team supporting the department. When I looked at risk, and you talk about a phrase, my phrase with our organization continued to be for many, many years was, let's be aggressive, but not reckless. And what I really mean by that, there's organizations and there's boards and there's individuals who are very risk averse and who are unwilling to take any risk at all. And then there's organizations and boards and people who like to take too much risk, and they're very, very reckless. This really is about how can you be aggressive, because everyone wants to move timelines to the left, everyone wants to go fast, but you can't go too fast. And so how do you take the risk calculus and manage the risk more? And that way you can be aggressive, but definitely not reckless. And that way you're not being risk averse, and you're really managing risk as a whole.
Yeah, I love that balanced approach. I'm sure we're going to come back to that. So, Mary.
Yeah, I had a catchphrase that I used in every command, every scenario with all my teams, and it's no friction, no traction. And I'm a STEM nerd, and so it was like the laws of physics. And because they'd say, what do you mean by no friction, no traction? And I'd say, think about a race car. It can't accelerate without friction between the tire and the road. So friction isn't an obstacle to traction, it's the source of it. And I would say in the industry world, you could loosely say that friction is risk, right? No risk, no reward. We don't want to mitigate all the risk, but like Bob says, we don't want to be reckless. And then I would put some context around it to say, hey, there's going to be friction. Other parts of the organization are going to disagree with us. That's okay. You may disagree with each other when you're coming to talk to me about something, an initiative or something. But we can disagree professionally and early enough that I would still have maneuver space, or we would give our boss above us maneuver space to act on that risk or that friction. If you get to consensus and it's too late, that's not alignment. It's an absence of governance. And so I'm certainly not saying interpersonal friction. That's a completely different case. But if your board never has friction, you might not be getting any traction either.
Great point. Eric?
Yeah, I would just say, I was commissioned soon after 9/11, and we all knew what that was the next decade plus was going to look like. So my entire career was spent, in combat operations. And that really accelerated when I got into special operations, and I was flying some very unique aircraft that was part of a joint force that was very unique and was razor sharp and was definitely at the pointy edge of the spear. And with that, we quickly learned that no is not the right answer. This discussion is about risk. So we found ways to get to yes. How are we going to support So much like my colleagues here, the other panelists have already stated, but embracing risk and don't be a stiff armor. Don't be one who just stiffs arms risk, throws your hands up in the air and says, no, we can't support that. It's too risky. But find a way to get to yes by understanding the risk. What are driving those higher levels of risk? What are the mitigation factors that are going to get you out there to support, the joint force that's putting themselves at risk? Because the ROI on that is very high. And we saw that in multiple national level missions. And that just got ingrained in me throughout my career. It's something that I continue to carry forward, even into when I'm advising board members and just having discussions and doing tabletop exercises with them. It's just don't have paralysis because of risk, but gather the information. There is a difference between deliberate and crisis planning, but you can get to yes for sure.
I love that sense of mission accomplishment there, Eric. Thank you so much. Listen, I would like to pivot a little bit here and ask each of you if you'd be willing to share a personal story about your journey along the way, something that has kind of related to this concept of leading under pressure, maybe something you participated in yourself or from the inside or witnessed from the outside. It doesn't matter. Eric, I'd like to ask you to kick this off for us, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the key takeaway, just the bottom line up front, really gets into the level of planning that is required, and the rehearsals and being able to, again, just to accept those higher risk situations. So I was fortunate enough to be deployed to Afghanistan, and I was co-located
Wait, did you
with,
say fortunate enough to be deployed to Afghanistan? I just want to make sure I heard that right.
well, fortunately, on that deployment, like many of my deployments, I was fortunate enough to be there co-located with some really tier one forces. So I'm with the best of the best. I always said I was constantly impressed with the level of professionalism and lethality. Every time I thought I met the greatest warriors ever that walked this planet, I would turn the corner and I would meet another group of individuals. And it always, to me, again, I found it fortunate to be a part of a team made up of all those warriors working towards one objective. This particular mission was the largest mission in Afghanistan in decades. It was massive. It was in a very difficult location. It was near the Pakistan border. There was a valley, so a lot of difficult terrain with caves. There was, the source of this or the objective was this was a training camp for suicide vest wearers as well as IDs, vehicle-borne IEDs, explosive devices, improvised explosive devices. And there had been a wave of VBIDs throughout Afghanistan that was disrupting the political objectives that we were working with our Afghan partners and the coalition. So in this, over course of this 3-day operation, my biggest concern was fratricide or was friendly fire. And the reason why is because of the terrain made it very difficult. There was no line of sight, so you could not see other elements of the joint force. You could not communicate with them because you did not have line of sight, so radios were getting blocked by terrain. There's plenty of caves that a lot of these insurgents and terrorists were hiding in, and we knew they had fortified. We had gathered a lot of intelligence. We had spent months preparing for this and gathering intelligence, all kinds of assets, both conventional and non-conventional special operations assets to gather all that intelligence. And coming together, it was going to be a lot of firepower. It was going to be a lot of conventional assets coming in for the first 24 hours. It was literally a 24-hour period of bombardment throughout that valley, and it had to be a surprise because we knew terrorist insurgents were going to be running into the caves and then isolating themselves and barricading themselves, which make it even more difficult. So after we planned this out, and that is again back to the bottom line up front, is the amount of planning that was required was extremely extensive. And we planned for worst case scenarios. So we didn't plan for our best day. We planned for the worst day. We planned for the Black Hawk Down situation. My biggest concern, again, alongside the fratricide and the friendly fire was how are we going to perform a casualty evacuation in that type of scenario? How are we going to guide helicopters into a makeshift ad hoc helicopter landing zone to extract somebody and get that get that warrior back to his family in the end. So there was a lot of planning, what we call rock drills, very extensive, where you're literally, this happened to be on a gym floor. We cleared all the equipment and we built a map, and we were walking it as if we were executing that mission. We were able to bring in, technology does help. So I knew there was a tech piece of equipment that was out there that my aircraft was capable of. So I knew that was going to provide a high level of situational awareness to prevent that fratricide and to enable that beyond line of sight communication. So I was able to, it was not easy, but I worked very hard, and I got the authority to operate, or the approval to use that classified system in that first time in a combat environment. So knowing the tools that you have available and then advocating for those tools and applying them, again, one of those ways to mitigate some of the risk. All that pre-planning with all the various teams and elements, to include, we had Green Berets that were running in two-man teams with 20 to 30 man Afghan elements. So how are we going to incorporate them and get them to communicate? All that was rehearsed extensively. All the emergency planning was rehearsed daily. And then we forward deployed in order to make this mission successful. So that was, one of the I would say one of the key missions I participated in that did really hammer home the need to understand risk, to understand what tools you have at hand, and then constantly planning for all the contingencies that could occur.
Thanks for sharing that, Eric. I appreciate that. I know the whole audience does. Mary, over to you.
Yeah, I also appreciate Eric's description of what they did. I would say very briefly, pressure isn't one thing. And in my career, between being in the field, in combat ops, being in the Pentagon, right, I'll briefly talk 3 different kinds of pressure. The first one, as Eric talks about, is keeping people safe and alive. During my deployment to Kabul, Afghanistan, we had an insider attack, and it killed Major General Harold Green, U.S. Army, and my next door neighbor in the general officer dorms. As the deputy director of intelligence during that time, I was responsible for the intelligence picture going forward to protect the 30 plus bases we still had as we were consolidating and drawing down, in about 40,000 personnel down to 15,000 when I left a year later. So that force protection was a daily decision, and the pressure, which information do you trust and believe, and where to focus your attention. And so that mental exercise of what's the worst that could happen and who's watching for it, that was my job. What was the worst that could happen? And we had experienced the worst that could happen with the shooting of General Green. That makes the pressure when you come back to the Pentagon, you put in a completely different perspective. In the Pentagon, the biggest pressure we face normally is the pressure of resource limits, right? The fight over the budget. In that job, I was responsible for modernizing our spectrum. How do we modernize into 5G and 6G in our electromagnetic spectrum strategy? There's no new money. There never, well, maybe this year, but normally there's never new money. Every transformation I had seen, and up until when I retired 2.5 years ago, claims that there's a budget. That budget does not exist. The real question is the pressure to figure out, what do you stop doing so that you can start doing these new things. And then the third type of pressure I experienced both in my military career and I think exists today, the pressure of a deadline, of a clock that maybe you can't negotiate with. When I was at US Cyber Command, we built a targeting and collection process for one of the first offensive cyber campaigns against the terrorist propaganda networks. There was decisions we had to make based on what we might see in their propaganda that could radicalize people, that could cause other attacks. So there is a pressure of time. Sometimes that time is flexible and sometimes it's not. So what I found as a leader is being very deliberate about understanding which type of pressure are we facing here, right? Those pressures are not interchangeable. And when you try to tell a bunch of people in the Pentagon, right, that something is urgent, it is nothing compared to what people working in, special operations like Eric was talking about, right? Those pressures are different. If you treat your budget squeeze like an enemy attack, or there's some kind of self-imposed deadline, your workforce is going to see through that, and that's going to lead to burnout. And in that manufactured urgency, that means it's sort of like, the Chicken Little. That manufactured urgency is a really expensive leadership mistake because you've given up your credibility with that false alarm. And then when you really need to lead under real pressure, you might not have the buy-in and people might be a little skeptical.
Thanks, Mary. Bob.
Thanks, Patrick. Amazing stories about pressure and how you manage risk. Being in the information technology and the cyber world for 40 years, to where even those who understand software development and coding, I was actually coding with punch cards way back in the day. So that shows you how it has significantly changed in the years that I've been part of this.
What is the punch card? I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
I'm going to pretend like I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, that's how you programmed computers to do what you wanted them to do versus just typing on a computer. The interesting thing, as I was thinking about pressure and about risk, uh, to me, there's a couple of different instances. And being in the information technology environment, to start with, there's pressure every single day of making sure that systems are up and operating. Whether that is for, as Mary talked about, in the Pentagon and the senior leaders within the Pentagon, that's also talked what Eric talked about, where making sure that the systems at the tactical level, where we have troops in combat and troops in contact, is very important. And so while pressure may be a little different in each of those situations, one's probably more of a safety of life, and others are more of I'll say safety of deadlines and safety of ensuring that you have the right command and control across the board. And so when I look at some of the pressures, as an example, when you are seeing the president talk each and every day, right? Whether you see him at in one of his staff meetings or you see him at a podium in front of at a campaign rally, um, the organization that I was with last was ensuring that the president's communication was always on and always available, no matter where the president was. So talk about pressure if a piece of equipment goes down 30 minutes before the president's ready to speak. Think about the Secretary of Defense, the number one individual in the department or Department of War, Secretary of War, and they're flying across country and making sure that at any point in time, the president and or combatant commanders and or any senior leader is able to stay in contact with them at any one time. That's a lot of pressure for those individuals who are there on the ground or in the air. And it's a lot of pressure for those back in the States or back wherever their data may be located. And so when you think about those different pressures, understanding that you've done everything in your power to make sure that they're prepared and that making sure that you have done everything in your power to make sure that they have the right technology, the right equipment, and also the right training and education. Why do I say education and training? Because to me, you educate for the known and you train for the unknown. And there's a lot of unknowns that occur when you're talking about the ability to command and control and the ability to provide the communications. So when you think about those pressures, that's very important. Now, the other aspect of pressure when you talk about the cyber world is in incidents that occur, right? An adversary or a criminal, if you're in the commercial world, is exploiting vulnerabilities within your network. And you're responsible for making sure, A, that doesn't happen, but when it does happen, or if it does happen, then you've got to have the right incident response available. And so to Eric's point, how have you trained? How have you made sure that the proper procedures are in place to make the speed as quickly as possible to assess the situation, prevent any additional either exfiltration of data or lateral movement, and drive the position of advantage back for your company and or your organization. So a lot of pre-planning is important, but the ability to respond in a timely manner is also important. So I've run the gamut of both, making sure that systems are up and available, to also making sure that they are secure for the senior leaders, but also the individuals at the tactical level who are doing yeoman's work no matter where they're located in the world.
Thank you. Just for all three of you, I really appreciate you sharing these deeply personal stories of your time in uniform. What I'd like to ask you to do now is take this one step further. Most in our audience are corporate board members, and you're no longer in the cockpits. You're no longer in the Pentagon. Can you take these lessons, these stories that you've shared, and translate them into maybe a framework or an experience that applies more directly to the corporate roles that you're in, that you and most of our audience are in now? Mary, if I can start with you, and for any thoughts from your perspective on that for our audience.
Yeah, I'll lead with one of the things that I learned early on, and while it was 30 years ago, it applies today in a slightly different way. One of the things the military would teach you is logistics, right? You have to have the things that you need at the right time, at the right location, in the right order. So logistics was sort of the heart of the risk. What we've seen, I would say, in a corporate world today, particularly if you are in cyber or AI or autonomous activity, emerging technology, this logistics is becoming a software supply chain issue. And so that same attention that we would focus on things we meant 20, 30 years ago, fuel, ammunition, parts, moving that physical stuff, today is whether the code or the apps that orchestrate these movements is trustworthy. Is our data in a cloud that is sovereign, or is it somewhere like the Middle East, right, where Iran attacked 2 Amazon cloud web servers, right, that impacted banking, and this whole effect that ripples throughout multiple commercial sectors? Are the chips inside all of this, do they come from a country that we trust to keep everything up and running like Bob talked about? Or is it calling back and streaming data, our proprietary information, so where it could be put at risk? And so the supply chain now isn't the trucks, it's the software that schedules the trucks, the API that talks to your supplier, a model that will forecast demand. And that has to include that geopolitical situation, right? Especially as we see what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. So planning for that unpredictable, or maybe unpredictable is not the right word, right? The predictable, but perhaps probability we thought was low, and the probability changes. So the question I bring from my military background into the boardroom is, do we have a single point of failure? Does that depend on a particular country, access to a particular country, a certain software coding, a certain chip that we don't fully control? And so that to me ties, my military experience to corporate governance in a way that I think is very relevant.
Yeah, I totally agree, Mary. Thank you. Bob.
Thanks, Patrick. And Mary took part of my answer on this one. When I go back to the first my first few years in the military, we were very big, and it's I've followed it throughout. Red teaming data flows. Um, and what do I mean by that, right? So red teaming, right? You go and you make sure that you're looking at any possible vulnerabilities or any possible shortages or any possible things that could be exploited. And you really look at whether it's your processes, your organization, your procedures. I would even say personnel professional development. Don't red team personnel, but I think you can red team the professional development of the personnel in the organization to make sure that they have the right education and the right training. And when you look at the data flows, I'll tell you, it is very enlightening. And I would offer most of the companies that I've advised um, don't understand the data flows of their processes and their organizations and their suppliers, as Mary talked about, their relationships. Um, Having that true visibility is the key to having good decisions because you have a comprehensive view and understanding of the organization, the mission, and the I'll say the relationships and some of those relationships are US based, some of them are allies and partners, and some you may find out aren't allies, partners, or nations, as Mary talked about earlier. And so I think, the ability to red team the data flows is one thing that I continually bring to the corporate process and the corporate board to say that it provides you more visibility and understanding. Because I would also, even within the military, when we would do that, we would be at 60 to 70% understanding on a good day to start with. And then you work on the processes to make that even higher. But that's red teaming data flows is key in my eyes as you kind of think through my military, what we learned in the military, and how that applies into the board process.
Thanks, Bob. That's that whole concept of incomplete information. You kind of really brought it to light there. Appreciate that. Over to you, Eric.
Yeah, being the lowest ranking member on this panel to include the moderator, I'm going to keep it very tactical and keep it somewhat tied to the cockpit because that's what I know and that's where I'm most at home. So what I've observed just interacting with board members, I was kind of surprised to be transparent and honest. I was surprised that they were not asking the questions that I thought they would when it comes to security and risk. Specifically, what I would recommend is asking the what if, right? As a board member, you should be, in my opinion, when you're interacting with the C-suite, you should be asking, what if this happens? What are we doing about this? How are we postured to handle this? Much like Mary brought up, supply chains, how are you going to handle that if something happens, if one of the critical lines of operations, choke points, maritime gets cut off like we have right now. Are you prepared for that? A lot of industry sectors were not. You could apply that obviously to the South China Sea. Is that company preparing for a line of communication to be shut down? And maybe that is their center of gravity. And what have they talked about the what ifing? How are they prepared to handle that? How are they prepared to protect the brand? And then thinking through it, a lot of crisis management, it seems like no one's thought of the issue or the circumstances that you find yourself. But in military, that's not true. In reality, you have been preparing for this. Maybe it's not this exact situation, but there is a plan that to deviate. And we know there's a checklist somewhere because someone's already thought of it. And now you're going to use that playbook or that checklist. Has your team, has your board, and has the company developed a playbook for these worst case scenarios? And then what if played the what if game if things don't go in alignment, in step with your playbook? Because they will not. I can tell you right now, as a strategist, I can tell you, you can have the greatest strategy in the world and a vision of where you need to be. But that doesn't mean you're going to get there because reality sets in. And, constantly what we always talked about was being in front of the aircraft. And how did you do that? You didn't just sit there complacent. You thought about what's the next thing that's going to happen. How am I going to react to that? John Boyd equated that to the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, and act. That is still applicable in the boardroom, especially during a crisis situation. So sorry to bring it back to the cockpit. I know you wanted me out of it, but I couldn't help but do so. Apologies.
No, I absolutely love that diversity of perspectives here, from the tactical to the strategic, from the cockpit to the Pentagon, and they're all focused back into the boardroom. I would love to pull on this string just a little bit more, kind of stay on this topic. And there are some military frameworks out there like commander's intent, mission command, red teams, which Bob already mentioned, post-mortem or pre-mortems versus after action reviews, which you've talked about as well, Eric. Which of these, if any, do you think are underutilized in the corporate environment, or could be transferred over into the corporate environment with some success? I'm going to switch the order back and start with you on this one, Eric, if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, it is it's after actioning, 100%, right? We always said it really depends on the culture of the organization, but I'll tell you, and being part of some very unique organizations, half the time I didn't even know the rank or the real name of the person I was talking to. Maybe a call sign, maybe an abbreviation. But you walked in there, it didn't matter what your rank was, what your position. What really mattered was your level of knowledge and expertise. What were you bringing to the table during that planning phase? And then more importantly, what did you see and what do you have the courage to say, we messed this up, we own it, and we're never going to mess this up again. And this is how we're going to prevent it from happening again. I don't really see that when I interact with a lot of corporate security teams. I get a lot of, we talk about it, we do a lot of planning, could be for like an overseas board meeting. And there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of flights and coordination, logistics, back to what was mentioned earlier. But rarely do we ever come back after the fact and talk about how did it go? What are those lessons we need to apply to future events, missions that we're going to be supporting? What could have gone wrong, and how did we, during that particular mission or event, how did we divert that risk and put it back into the acceptable level versus getting out of control? Was that due to an activist protest? How did we monitor that threat? Were we prepared to do so? Or did we have to apply some ad hoc capabilities that we weren't prepared to, but it ended up working? And how could that have gone better? Really, to me, it is just having the courage to be humble, approachable, credible, and accept that, not everything's going to go right, but we're going to own it. We're not going to worry about what position that person is in. And we're going to apply it to future events and missions so that in the end, we're successful.
Thanks, Erica. I appreciate you saying what I will share. The most powerful experiences and the biggest learning events that I can recall over the course of my time in the military were from the painful and brutal honesty that came in those after action reviews. It's not fun to hear, but you really benefit and improve as a result of hearing that. So thanks for sharing that. Bob.
Thanks, Patrick. And Eric, thanks for taking the AAR and the blameless postmortem and what we call debriefs. Um, I'd like to take a different turn though, and I would say commander's intent is something that's I think a little misunderstood and not very well done. In today's environment, where you have almost constant communication, constant feeds from the battle space, right? Constant feeds, constant information that you can gather. We've lost the ability from an empowering standpoint and from allowing organizations to understand here's a commander's intent that can last more than a few days or can last more than a few hours or can last more than a few minutes. And what I see in the military, because of all this information that's available, um, senior leaders want to be more involved, even down to the tactical level at times, which causes inefficiency and causes the inability um, to be innovative in my eyes. And so when I look at it from a corporate board standpoint, the ability to have the commander's intent and the goals and objectives that are written well enough or well enough understood that individuals don't have to come back and say, Mother, may I, or don't have to come back to the board and or to the CEO or to a different level to get permission to act and to be flexible to enable the success of the organization to reach even higher heights. And so I think as you kind of look at as you're looking from a board standpoint, is the guidance that you put out and the guidance that the CEO of the organization is putting out, is that enabling the empowerment of the individuals and the organization at lower levels, or are lower levels having to come back to the higher levels for approvals? Now, again, that doesn't mean that they can go be reckless, right? There's an aggressive part of this, and there's an understanding from a risk standpoint that there's certain things that have to come up to the C-suite or have to come up to the board. But I don't think there's a good enough balance in the boards that I've been dealing with, and understanding where that balance is to have the right hybrid approach on making sure that the commander's intent is, or the director's intent, or the board's intent is understood, that allows a micromanagement environment.
Yeah, that was fantastic, Bob. And I just wrote that down. CEOs, put your vision out there and then empower people, let them do their job and get it done. I love that. I think that's great advice. Mary.
Yeah, given that Bob and I were commanders together at the same time when he commanded 25th or 24th Air Force and I had 25th, probably not shocking that I agree with him that commander's intent is really important. Here's what success looks like. Here's what I as a commander will not accept. Here's the maneuver space that I'm giving so you can act when conditions change and I'm not available and you can't reach me. Even with all the modern technology, right? There's going to be times when you don't have time or you don't have the capability, not DIS's fault, that you can't communicate. And so can the board tell you, in one sentence, what is the strategic intent of the company and what is management's maneuver space? I'm on the board of a company that's organizing, and I had a meeting with the CISO, and even the two of us were sort of like, how much are people comfortable with us talking, sharing information, right? And we're organizing, so we're going to get that squared away, but how much maneuver space does the CISO have? When does he have to notify the board, not to consider other SEC considerations and financial things? So how do you make sure that you're ready to deal with that ambiguity once environment changes? The CEO needs to know how far the CEO can lean forward, or be more conservative. Is the board going to push or are they going to restrain? And so, having the CEO write down the commander's intent and then comparing it to what the rest of the executive team thinks the CEO's intent is, would be a good exercise. And because I'm a kind of a learn by example person, I'll put in the chat, as much as I hate to admit it, the Marines, my husband is a retired Marine. He served for 31 years in the Marine Corps. The Marines are really good at commander's intent. So I'll give you the example as we move on to the next question of one of General Mattis's commander's intent back in 2003. So you can see, how specific it can be or just how powerful it could be, right? There's just no doubt on what his intent was.
Thanks, Mary. What I'll say, these are great. I want to take this one step down further. I'll say that NACD audiences tend to be really hungry for practical takeaways. Like, what are some practical tips that I can take back to my boardroom, or maybe even a question that I can ask my management team during our next board meeting? I would love if each of you would share maybe one, or we don't have a lot of time, but maybe one or two tips or takeaways or recommendations for our audience. Bob, I'd like to start with you if you've got something on your mind that you're willing to share.
Yes, as you know, there's always something on my mind, and I'm always willing to share. I think in today's environment, I think boards and organizations need to understand the level of artificial intelligence that's being leveraged and used in their environment, specifically agentic artificial intelligence. And why do I say that? Because I suspect most don't know the different large language models that their employees are using. They don't understand the roles and responsibilities and the permissions that some of their agents that they have going on in their networks and in their environments have been given by the administrators. I don't think they understand the risk and the legal risk from what could happen if an agent goes outside of the bounds of their network or goes outside of the bounds of what they originally intended for that agent. And I think it is and the final piece I'd say on that is from an education standpoint, just giving artificial intelligence capabilities and tools to an individual doesn't make that individual and that technology successful. And in fact, I would offer is there's a lot of individuals who don't understand how to leverage AI, and they're making matters worse within their organization and within their environment. So I think truly understanding everything about the level of AI that's being used within the environment, specifically agentic AI, and the identities of those agents is very important as an organization moves forward.
Thanks, Bob. I can't believe we went 47 minutes without raising the AI thing, but it had to be said. So thank you very much. Eric.
Yeah, I'll continue where General Skinner kind of started with AI. I would just say there's a lot of activism out there, both internal and external to your organizations. That type of behavior, that nefarious behavior, is being accepted socially. So either an external penetration or an internal release of information that is going to tarnish the brand that could we exercised this recently there in Palo Alto. This can quickly spin out of control to where now the executive team is at risk, both physically and digitally. Your travelers, due to the brand and what may be released due to lack of security, could also be in jeopardy. So how are you preparing for a scenario that would start with possibly some type of, artificial intelligence, some type of technical leak, whether done on purpose or unintentionally, that would put you in bad light, that would tarnish your brand, that would then have material negative effects on that company. So that is something I would consider and ask, and how are you protecting not just the company, but the leaders and the brand overall in the ways you're thinking about security.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Eric. Listen, I now want to share a couple of the questions we've gotten from the audience. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw out three questions and then open up for any of you to answer any or all of those questions. You can pick and choose among them. So the three I'm going to pick are, the first one is, what distinguishes healthy risk taking under pressure from recklessness? Number two, is in high stake environments, how do you cultivate a sense of comfort so where your subordinates feel comfortable raising information quickly that needs to be raised, even when it's not going to be typically welcome information to be heard. And then the third question here is about black swan events. Is there a model or a tool that can help you plan and prepare for these black swan events, which are by definition not really plannable? So I'll pause a minute and see whether any of you want to take
Yeah.
on any of those questions for our audience.
Let me take number two. How do you communicate to your workforce, right, that you want to hear information, like I don't call information good or bad, it's information. In addition to a commander's intent, I always show a chart that I stole from Amy Edmondson in a Harvard Business Review article many years ago, before she wrote her last two books. And it was the spectrum of failure. And the first one is lack of integrity, willful disregard of laws, processes, and that was blameworthy failure. There will be consequences if you're in my organization and we fail because you did something that let you bad, lack of integrity, criminal. The middle part, I always felt like I owned, and I let them know that so that they could tell me the task is too complex. Maybe it's lack of resources to do the job. Or lack of training, right? I just threw a new tool out there and said, go. And so by telling them, right, if we're failing because of these things, then it's my job to fix that. But if I don't know, I can't fix it, right? I will own that. And then the last one, is a chemistry nerd, science geek, was the praiseworthy failure, right? That it was okay to experiment, right? Just make sure you identify your variables, you hold some things constant, and you take good notes so that we can analyze it, right? What was your hypothesis, right? And generating new learning. I feel like that framework created a culture with why they could come to me and tell me why we were not accomplishing our goals. And they wouldn't necessarily, everyone didn't get blamed. It was, we were going to learn from it.
Yeah, great speak up culture points there, Mary. We've got about one more minute if anyone wants to field any more of these any of those questions I threw out. If not, I will pause for a second. If not, I'll pivot to kind of some closing points for each of you, an opportunity.
30 seconds or less. I don't believe there's any such thing as a black swan event. You should be able to prepare for those. You should be looking at the threat landscape, forecasting, projecting out, bringing in, General Skinner said it, bringing in red cell teams to consult, help you out with that. But you should not be surprised that there's an economic crisis, that there's a global pandemic. There's all signs of these happening right now. You shouldn't be surprised that a war would put supply chains at risk. So I would push back that you don't need a model for a black swan event because there is no such thing. You should be preparing for it all the time.
And Patrick, I'd just like to add, you incentivize the behavior that you want. And you can incentivize in many different ways, right? Mary talked about praiseworthy. There's monetary type incentives, but you incentivize, and so there's through all of the questions that we've offered today, and all the comments, the incentivization is a key way of getting the behavior you want.
Awesome leadership tips from three amazing leaders. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to give you each 30 to 60 seconds for your final thought. It can be anything you want, a tip, a recommendation, a board question, a thought on this topic, whatever it is. We're going to go Bob and then Mary and then close out with Eric. Bob, over to you.
So, first off, I just want to say thanks for the time today. I've learned just as much from this panel as I hope everyone else has. I think at the end of the day, the key to air power was always said is flexibility, and having flexibility within your commander's intent, flexibility within your PACE plans, right? And I don't know if we talked about PACE plans, but having the plans in place for primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency type of situations goes to Eric's black swan comment, goes to the ability to have communications up at all times. Having that as part of your foundation is key and important.
Thanks, Mary.
I'll go back to when did your board last surface a real disagreement? And was it early enough where you could influence the outcome? No friction, no traction.
All right, Eric, over to you.
Yeah, I really think it does come down to empowering your people. Empowering your people, like General O'Brien said, to have that discontent, to provide that friction, to push back. That's when you're going to really get to opening everyone's aperture and really getting into back to what I was describing with the what if questioning and then the planning and therefore understanding the threat landscaping and preparing for that. So I 100% agree. It's empowerment, it's mission command that follows right along with commander's intent.
All right. Well, thank you all. And on behalf of the entire audience, I'll say that we just got a master class in leadership under pressure. I want to thank you all, not only for your time here today, but your service to the nation over the course of your careers. Really appreciate the great work. Also want to thank our sponsors, Zscaler and Global Guardian, for making the event possible. And then I want to close out by thanking our NorCal NACD team, Lisa and crew. Really, really appreciate all the hard work you do to put this together for the entire NACD across the nation. And for all of you in the audience, thank you for joining us today, and I appreciate your time. So thank you all and have a great rest of your week.